Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Chris Torrence with another episode of the semi-related podcast hosted by Optum. There's a lot going on in the world, guys, right? Like this has been an interesting couple of weeks since the administration transitioned, and there's obviously the big news from the weekend is these tariffs. I think that's made the headlines through and through. We're also, like I said, in the middle of conference season for the fall. I guess I should say the spring, winter, spring, kind of leading up to it. One of the big ones coming up is TPM, obviously out in Long Beach, the West Coast. And so again, all things considered, there's a guy that I think I met. I'll try to jog my memory, but known for the industry for quite a few years now. And I was just saying off camera with Eric, we've never really had a chance to kind of connect other than in passing at very hectic events and like, hey, I got to go. We'll catch up later, right? That kind of scenario. So awesome to have Eric Johnson with the JOC, S&P Global. Like, this is a guy that like I said, I really wanted to try to get some quality time with. So I'm glad it finally happened. So Eric Johnson, I think everybody probably knows of you, if not know you personally. How you doing, man? Happy Monday.
I'm doing great, Chris. Yeah, happy Monday. Happy chaotic Monday.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite. I was trying to think. I think we first met,
Oh,
if I'm
there's a
not
story.
mistaken, at Gartner,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think you were you had just moved from Robinson to Uber Freight, if I'm not
Oh,
mistaken.
yeah. Oh,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah.
That was
Okay.
it. I
So that would
remember.
have been like 16, 17.
Yeah, it was shortly after I got over to Uber, and I remember because we were it was just like call it serendipitous to some extent. We're leaving I think it was Gartner out in
Yeah.
maybe Scottsdale or something.
Oh yeah.
We're out in front of the hotel, kind of chatting. I don't think I knew you really well, but I
Yeah.
think we were both had the obvious I'm getting an Uber look, the
Yeah. Yeah.
thumbs
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
And I think I had just realized that like one of the perks at Uber was they gave us these credits,
Right.
and I think I said I never used them that much, so I was like, hey, you know what? I'm going to get a big like one of those black SUVs and just they're going like a mile away, but whatever, right? So
Hey.
you and I that was kind of our
Yeah.
introductory little one-on-one time, and from then on, man, I
Hit it
think
off right away. Yeah, I remember that.
yeah. And I've seen you. I mean, for those listening, Eric is out and about. It's hard not to hear his name if not see him in person on podcasts. One of the I'll say this, and I mean it sincerely, is we're Eric is a journalist, and he's a journalist that covers a lot of technology, and I'll let him kind of go into more of that. But um, most importantly, I think when you talk about journalistic integrity, I kind of want to ask you a little bit about that. There's always a spin this day and age, and media gets, media's media, and you could raise a whole nother set of conversations and topics, and without, the politicization of everything, it's a lot. But Eric is a guy that just simply put, he keeps it real. I've always appreciated that. He's very just as objective as he can be, and again, in an age where these sensational stories and headlines tend to get a lot of attention, I think Eric always tries to get the scoop on the story, and I guess factual based, and again, it's always making sure he covers all the angles with various constituents in terms of the industry and any story or topic he's researching. So, kind of with that, Eric, I wanted to kind of take you back a little, man. I know you're a West Coast guy by nature. Are you in the Beltway this morning? Home?
Yeah, I am in the Beltway. I'm in
Alexandria, right? Ish. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I go back to like, did you as a kid, man, or are you the guy that was always just kind of glued into like the why questions, a lot of questions as a kid? This is prior. I know I'm in the Midwest. I know you did a little time up in Madison, I believe,
did, yeah, I went to
undergrad work.
college
So.
in Madison for journalism.
Well,
So
when did the bug hit you? Like,
yeah,
interesting career choice, and was it a kid, or were you like it evolved to kind of like I think this is where I want to go?
it's a good question. Actually, I don't know if I've ever been asked like when I've been asked like, you know, how I started writing and all that, but like when it happened, the God's honest truth is until I was like 13, I thought I was going to be in the NBA.
Oh, don't we all? Still
Yeah,
the dream.
yeah, I know. I still waiting for that call.
The
And
Lakers had a slot for you, but they went with
they
Luca.
went with Luca.
I don't know.
He's a little bit fast.
Eric had my vote
I'm
just for
probably in better shape than he is. So I was a big fish in a little pond at a middle school where I played basketball and was pretty
yeah.
decent, like not
Yeah,
amazing,
yeah.
but decent. And I had big ambitions. My last name was Johnson. I grew up in
Oh,
LA. I thought I was
yeah,
going to replace Magic after he retired.
that's right.
And um, then I went to like a really competitive high school, from a high school that had very competitive sports. And I learned very quickly the difference between like good fish in a small pond to like mediocre fish in a very big pond.
Yeah.
So at some point, I think the wheels started turning like, okay, I probably need to focus on these other things. I was always decent in school. Like it wasn't, I was like a good student, right? So it
Yeah.
wasn't like I was like a dumb jock or anything like that. But also writing always came naturally to me.
Yeah.
So when I started, thinking, oh, okay, I really need to think about where my life goes, like in high school at some point. It was, I read the newspaper, especially the sports section, voraciously. So it was sort of a natural thing to be close to something
Hmm.
without being actually in it. So really it was like the idea was to be a sports reporter. I did that in college a little bit, and I got an internship to do it while I was in college at a real newspaper and hated it. It actually made me hate sports,
Oh, okay. The sports part.
the
Got it.
sports part. But I realized that the writing came really naturally to me. The interviewing did not necessarily. So that's an interesting thing that I think most
Yeah.
people don't understand about journalism is there's three types of journalists. I'm sure people have a lot of bad words to describe the types of
Fill in the
journalists.
blank. Yeah. Yeah.
For people in the industry, as far as I'm concerned, there's three types. There's people who are really good at writing, of which I consider myself that in
I
that
would
category.
concur.
There's
Yes.
people who are excellent interviewers. They get maximum information extracted from people, but they're like mediocre at writing. Some are even bad. The honest truth is that editors do a lot of work
Yeah.
with some people, but those people are really valuable because they're getting the information. The best journalists are amazing at both,
Yeah.
right? So over time, I think I've gotten better at interviewing. I'm
Yeah.
definitely not the best. I'm definitely nowhere near the best. I've gotten, because that part didn't come naturally to me. The writing came naturally.
Yeah.
So I always feel like it takes me 10 hours to like get all the information I need, and it could take me 20 minutes to put it together because that's the part that's always come naturally. So
Well, for what it's worth, man, and I'll say this again for those listening, and Eric, you have a gift when it comes to the prose and the writing piece. I mean, a way of there's writing and there's different forms of writing. But I think in terms of just being able to weave in a narrative that resonates with a reader that's not looking to get inundated with too
yep.
much jargon or very specified niche areas that, you have a very good flow. And again, I just think that's again, why I think I often refer to you as like, give you a shout out once in a while, like, hey, really good piece. And yeah, the topic was great, but the way you broke it down, and the way the flow of the narrative works has always engaged me. So for what it's worth, man, the writing piece. Eric, do you remember your first interview when it mattered? Since that was the wobble, if you will, you had the writing down. You really want to get better at interviewing. Anybody you looked
Yeah,
up
there
to,
was some.
maybe? Anybody that
I actually didn't write for my high school newspaper,
got it?
honestly. So I didn't get into it till college. I went to college to get into journalism.
Yeah.
So it would have been, I think I interviewed someone on the University of Wisconsin track team. I think
Okay.
that was my first interview, and it was. I'm sure it was awful. I'm sure I had everything scripted out. I'm sure it was like, where do you see yourself in 5 years, and
Right.
what's
Right.
your biggest strength, and what's. I mean, it was probably like a world's worst job interview, like equivalent to
Got to
that.
start somewhere, though, right?
Yeah,
Might as well be
yeah,
the track team at Madison, right?
yeah. She was probably like that. Hopefully, I run into better, more professional reporters.
Oh man, no.
Career progresses. But yeah, it's something like that. I do remember, and this has nothing to do with what we're supposed to be talking about, but I
It never
appreciate
is. That's the beauty of it.
I recognize. So I started off my career with in Southern California working at
Yeah.
a newspaper called the Orange County Register, which is a big
Mhm.
newspaper in Orange County.
Still in circulation?
What was that?
Still in circulation today?
I believe it is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Like most newspapers, it's a lot smaller than it used to be.
Yeah. Print media,
Um,
right? Yeah.
yeah, it's difficult. But remember the first week or first couple weeks, this was a small like bedroom community in Orange County, and so there wasn't like a lot of like news. It was a lot of human interest stuff. But
Yeah.
man, I got thrown into the deep end, and I'm making it like about myself. These were two awful stories actually. There was a kid at the local high school who died during a soccer game. And
Ouch.
then there was another kid at the high school who was battling leukemia. And amongst my first stories I had to do was like go and knock on doors for people whose kid had died, and people, and it was like I am not trained to do this. Like I'm trained to
Yeah.
ask a question and write a
A whole
story.
other level.
The emotional component of
Yeah.
that is a totally different thing. And yeah, it's not an easy job. It honestly isn't an easy job to do. I think most reporters are doing their absolute best under a lot of time constraints, a lot of pressure, a lot of accuracy expectations, which is fair. But yeah, it's the emotional component of it, especially when you're writing about stuff like that, is not taught in school, honestly.
Yeah. I don't know that you can ever be prepared to engage under those kind of circumstances,
Yeah,
right? Whether you're
yeah,
delivering bad news or follow-up questions. And
yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's a tough,
How do you ask a mom? How do you feel about your son dying in a soccer game?
and you almost feel like I don't even like, how do I even ask? Like,
I
can I
know,
even ask that?
totally,
Right?
totally, yeah,
Well, kind of like, yeah, that's a crazy way to kind of have to kind of sink or swim in that scenario. And obviously you've kind of, that gave you exposure, right? And you've been working on your craft since then. Eric, growing up though, I kind of go back again. So we're around the high school and into college years of journalism. I'm nothing like watching a great interview or a great journalist that, like you said, that ability to extract information in a way that doesn't come. It comes across as like it's very subtle, right? Maybe some interviews are much more direct and poignant. Sometimes they have to be. But like, is there anyone growing up that you kind of, whether it was like maybe it's sports, right? Like a commentator or another journalist at Sports Illustrated or ESPN, like,
yeah.
and maybe it gravitated to more of like in a different, outside of the sports arena. So I'm just like, did anyone growing up, other than Magic Johnson, when on your NBA dreams, like, did anybody stand out?
Yeah, I mean, there's been various ones. There was a columnist for the LA Times named Jim Murray, who was
Okay.
always, I think most people, he was a sports columnist. I
Yeah.
think most people looked up to him. I was always more attracted to like columnists because
Yeah.
they got a chance to sort of riff on an idea, and it was more
Yep.
about the quality of their writing than it was about oh, did they get this tidbit of information? Like, I didn't grow up watching All the President's Men or, like
Right. Right.
being like, oh, those, I like, those hard nosed journalists are my inspiration, right?
Right.
I was much more about like, how do you write something so that the message reaches the audience, right? That was always, I was more interested, like I said before, I was always more interested in the writing part of it than the interviewing part of it. So, that definitely gravitated more toward them. And then like in my 20s, I distinctly remember I got super into soccer,
Yeah.
European soccer,
Mm-hmm.
and in my late college, early years. And I
Went over to Leeds, right?
well, I'm a Leeds
Yeah.
United supporter, long suffering, 26 years now. I distinctly remember being blown away by the quality of the writing on like British news sites about like just a game, and they would write it. It was
Fierce,
like
right? It's
poetry.
fierce. Yeah. Yeah.
It was like poetry. And so I started to think like, how do I take something that's pretty prosaic and try to make that like sort of a joy to read? So that's
Right.
always definitely and that's the same. I mean, now I write about logistics technology, which talk about a niche that like only a certain amount of people in the world care about.
Yeah.
A lot of the people that I'm writing to know more about the subject than I do, right? So how do you write it in a way that like engages them and makes a difference to them and matters, So
Well, how did Eric? You mentioned you are in a niche area. It's not a Thanksgiving dinner that everyone at the table is going to really understand. At least
no,
in my experience.
yeah, no, God.
I always tell people it's like what do you do in logistics again? Every
Yeah,
Thanksgiving.
yeah.
Then COVID happens and there's a toilet paper shortage. Everyone's like, it just connected the dots.
All Chris's fault.
Right, right. What did you guys do? And it's just again,
Yeah.
it kind of brought it. It was a lesson in supply chain of look around this room. Everything that's here was
Right.
produced or manufactured. How did it get here? You ever think about it? And then the toilet paper is like, it doesn't always work smoothly. And there's a lot of moving parts of why these things can happen. And it kind of just that one Thanksgiving around, I guess, 2021 or whatever.
Yeah.
It just kind of, like I said, it connected the dots for everyone. I was like, oh, that's what goes on behind the scenes that we take for granted. Yeah, that's right.
It's the offensive lineman thing.
It's the O-line.
Better analogy, right? Like,
You
only
need
get noticed when you do something wrong. Yeah.
Well, how do you then, Eric? Again, you're kind of going down the sports. You got some football in Europe. You got some on that track. You're at where you are today. When does that transition into the logistics supply chain arena as a journalist start to take shape?
So it was about so I was at that newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
I went to grad school in England,
Yeah.
came back, got a job covering the ports of LA and Long Beach
Boom. There it is.
for a different newspaper called the Long Beach Press Telegram, which, pouring one out here, no longer exists. Uh,
Yeah.
and then 2 years later, I got hired by American Shipper, which
Mm-hmm.
many people will remember. I mean, it still
I
exists.
do. Yeah.
Yeah. But and I worked there for 12 years, but that was really, I was kind of thrown into what I'll call goods movement um, in 2003. And then 2 years later, I was in a trade publication, and then it was like prime time because, from '03 to '05, I was writing about the ports to a very
Mhm.
uneducated audience when it came to the ports. Like, you could
Yeah.
kind of write anything. They're not going to know. Unless their family is a longshoreman, like the
Right.
only reason they would know anything about what's going on at the ports. Not to say I was writing inaccurately, but it was,
No, no, I
writing
get
in
it.
a
I
different
get it.
way
Yeah.
to the general audience. And then 2 years later, you're like writing to experts.
Right.
So you better know your stuff,
Yeah.
and it's pretty apparent when you don't. So that
That's
sort
right.
of changed the mindset to become, over time. Obviously, it didn't happen immediately, but to try to become, sort of something between a journalist and an analyst or an expert, because you just can't just take things that people write and put them down and then that's the gospel truth like
Yeah.
you do kind of in newspaper reporting. It You need more depth, you need the context, you need to go really, granular,
Yeah.
because that's the thing that moves the needle when you're writing to a trade rather than in
Right.
general to a population about something that's happening that they don't know about.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of that, what do we not know, Eric? And I kind of, again, I think for folks that aren't in journalism, we kind of just take it for granted that, oh, this just the piece came out, and the amount of sweat equity and blood, sweat, tears, all that you mentioned, the tight timelines, all the behind the scenes thing. What is the one thing the general audience that probably doesn't really understand about your role and in
Mm.
your career in journalism that we should?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, so, okay, I'll go to two things that I talk about a lot
Okay,
whenever I feel like getting up on my soapbox a little
let's
bit to
do
try
it.
to educate people.
The floor
So,
is yours, sir.
the one thing I would say is there's this big discussion about whether media is biased or not, right? And I think first and foremost, every person in media is a human being, right? We believe certain things to be true and we believe other things to be untrue, just like every other human being on the planet.
Yeah,
The challenge for a journalist is not whether you have beliefs, it's whether you can compartmentalize that while you're reporting on a subject and have the information that you get, whether it's a piece of data
right.
or it's a perspective that someone who's an expert in that area tells you, um, you know, to take that and synthesize it in a way that the reader doesn't really even understand where you stand on the issue, right? Because that's
Objectivity. Yeah.
editorializing, right?
Perceived objectivity. Yeah.
Yeah, and that belongs in commentaries and
Yeah.
op-eds, and there's plenty of places where that belongs. The challenge for a reporter is, like, I may believe President X is a terrible person, whether you believe that before January 20th or after January 20th,
Right.
and I write in a way that people don't even have any idea which way I lean, right? Like
Right.
that's the
That's a
if you're a
skill.
political reporter, I don't
Yeah.
have to worry about that much,
Right.
all
Right.
that much. But so it's this idea that, like, you know in our industry, like, a reporter favors one company and over another, or favors one type of company versus another. Like, you have to avoid that at all costs. So you have to get different perspectives. You have to include as many perspectives as you can. So that's one thing, right?
Yeah.
Like,
That integrity piece, I think, is so key, but I don't think people probably understand how hard it is. You walk that line, you're dealing with all these dynamics of I want objective truth, whatever that means.
Yep.
But
Yep.
you also like I think that is a skill, right? Because we in a hyper like politicized world we live in, more and more. You nailed it, Eric. The bias. Everyone's no matter. It's the spin, right? That whole what's your source, right? And does that source have a
Has a lane.
preconceived
Right.
path or an inclination to go?
But
You
it's
should
like
think
it's simple. It's simple, right? Like, okay, let's take it in our industry, right? Okay, someone who doesn't like freight brokers thinks freight brokers are ripping off shippers and carriers, right? If I interview someone who is a longtime freight broker, successful freight broker, I have to identify them who they are, and then the between the lines, it's like obviously their perspective is going to be that freight brokers serve a valid purpose
sure,
in the industry
yeah,
and are a valuable tool for both sides of the demand supply picture,
yeah,
and identifying them as such gives the context needed to understand where their perspective is, right? And
right.
so it's little things. It's not like you have to batter someone over the head and say, by the way, Chris thinks freight brokers are great because he makes a good living off of that, them existing. You know what I
No,
mean?
no bias. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's like obviously someone who's a freight broker is going to have a bit of a bias toward
Shocker, shocker.
arguing that they are, serve a valuable role. And obviously someone who's a carrier who's been burned by 15 brokers is going to have a different perspective, right? And so that's why, you have to include all those perspectives, but you also have to write it in a way that it's clear where those perspectives are coming from.
Yeah,
So, yeah. So
I don't. Yeah, that's
the
great.
other, real quickly,
You got to
real,
stay your principles. Yeah, yeah,
the other thing I would mention, and I alluded to it earlier, is time,
yeah.
right? So, and I think everyone in the freight industry can sort of identify with this in a way, right? Like we are all having to make decisions
Mm-hmm.
with time as the major constraint, right? Like
Always.
ultimately, we would love to have all the time in the world to make a decision and make sure it's the right one, but that's not how it really is, right? Like a
Right.
load is there. Do I go with this party or this party? Do I go? You know what I mean? So it's the same for reporters. We have a certain number of hours in the day. We
Yeah,
are expected to take a subject,
yeah.
learn as much as we can about it if we don't know something about it already, talk to as many people as we can about it, find as much data as we can, and do it in a really
And hit
fast,
a deadline. Yeah,
because
yeah.
and because people want information like yesterday. They don't want it in 5 minutes or an hour. So I would posit that most people's problems with media in general these days are down to the lack of alignment between their expectations about when they want information delivered
Right,
and the reality that the more time you take on a subject, the more accurate and more
right.
informed that take is going to be. So
Makes sense to me. Yeah. Erica, I don't, and again, I commend you for that because I can't imagine that's easy. Both of those constraints, right? The time and then just kind of, again, realizing that
it's
it's all
yeah,
about perspective. And there is a natural inherent bias in how everyone answers any question, right? It's just
of
how
course.
it's humans. You nailed
Yep.
it.
Yep.
I don't know. Like I feel like it's hard not to interject your own principles that you live and die by, but
Yep.
yet it's like the going in and interviewing someone that you know or you perceive them to be completely opposite to you in just about every way, shape, and form. But you have to take the just take a deep breath and say, hey, I the only way I'm going to hear your side of the story is if I kind of break down those barriers
Sure.
and not just the hearing versus listening, right? I hear you or am I listening to you?
Right.
I think
Right.
that's a
Right.
skill that unfortunately I feel like as humans, for a lot of reasons, society's shown
And one ear out there.
we subscribe to channels, and I lose that term very loosely, but any medium, right, that reinforces our preconceived beliefs, notions, etc. We subscribe to that, and I think that's where it gets interesting in journalism today. There used to be, but I'll say a more limited or finite amount of medium outlets, and now thanks to the digital era, right? It is literally
Everybody thinks
I
different.
mean, talk about niche, right? It's like yeah, everyone can,
There's no barrier to entry. I mean, I
right?
love some of the parallels between like, logistics or trucking
Yeah,
and media, right? And the internet is the democratizer across a bunch of different industries, right? And
yeah,
so when I first started in 98 in journalism, it was like, in order for me to get a story onto the front page of the Orange County Register, I would have had to gone through, I mean, I can't even think of how many different people would have read and ripped apart and then finally okayed that story. It would have been something on the order of 10 to 15 people.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Nowadays, if you go to like a major newspaper, I guarantee that number has shrunk significantly. Even like New York Times, Washington Post, there will be a lot fewer layers to a story being published. And some of those layers they might be using AI as a first
Yeah.
pass, right? And so that has changed remarkably. And then the flip side is like, you don't need to be part of a major news organization to get the distribution to reach an
Bingo.
audience anymore, right? Like
Mhm.
you could start little newsletters, but you literally had to print something out and hand it out
Right.
in your
Right.
local neighborhood to compete with the LA Times.
Right.
Now, website is just as good a distribution as anything, or newsletters, Substack, that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's too many, honestly. Like
Yeah.
I sort of cringe at this idea, like everybody is a reporter. It's like, no, because not everybody has the skills to be a reporter.
Bingo. Yeah.
And
It is a skill.
I'm not saying we do like brain surgery or anything like that, but you do need to have some founding about like the ground rules of this business. And then secondly, most people who've gotten into this themselves have a sort of ultimate goal that's outside of just informing the audience,
What
right?
is that goal, do you think, Eric?
Well, so
Could be any
for
myriad, maybe.
instance, you've seen a lot of people in the tech community have said mainstream media is not to be trusted. So
Yeah.
we are going to create our own media channel where we tell our story without the filter of a news outlet. Great. That's called a blog. That's
Yeah.
not a media outlet because you're
Right.
telling
Right.
your story, and you have no one checking you. You have no one asking a question that might be hard. You have no one countering an argument that you are
Bingo.
making,
Yeah.
whether it's the reporter or whether it's another person the reporter interviews, right? Like no one at a VC is going, I'm going to write a story about this amazing company that I just invested in, but I'm also going to interview someone who is super skeptical about that company
Balance it
being
out. Yeah.
successful, right? They don't do that.
Right.
That's
Right.
not that's a blog. That is not journalism, right? But it's
I
all
agree.
kind
Yeah.
of thrown into this big bouillabaisse of content, which is my least favorite word in the whole world. But
And I mean, it's just so much. And then social media, right? Your one tweet or a post or anything like, and now we're in an age, Eric, of goes back to the journalistic integrity aspect, right? An age of where we hear terms like misinformation, disinformation. Like
yeah,
it's scary because I think people, again, going back to what I said, you kind of, inherently you subscribe to outlets or anything that reinforces like, yeah, I'm right. They said I'm right, right? It's just, again, that's the human nature. But are we at a point now? Is there a such thing as objective truth anymore in this world we live in, or is everything have at
oh,
its root
this
an
got deep.
ulterior motive? Right? Like these are the existential questions. Sometimes I'm thinking about, and it's easy to blame media, but again, and rightfully so in some cases, right? Can it
Right,
be? Can you be bought? It's the pay to play, right?
right.
I don't know. This is what worries me as much about, and this is not just related to any one particular media outlet. Just again, an existential
Yeah,
question of I can literally turn on whether I'm watching the news sources, reading an article. Like it's almost like the ability for us to critically think and think independently and be able to understand differing perspectives, right? And you don't have to agree, right? It's like Dave
right,
Chappelle was like, among other celebrities, like, look, I may not agree. Doesn't mean like I don't hate you. But
right.
have we gotten away from that though? Do you feel that? And again, I want to I don't want to
Oh
go too far
yeah,
down this path, but I feel like it's just something that I wanted to say because you are a journalist in my eyes, and I can only imagine just it's got to be tough in a lot of ways because everyone's going to say, well, yeah, Eric Johnson wrote that because Eric, he actually leans this way, or he's these are his people over here, and he has an interest. I don't know. It's just like, and then you get to this. It's really bad when lies, alternative facts, whatever you want to call it, becomes kind of like as a society, at least in this country, we're like we almost take it as everything is like it's got to be true. I saw it on the internet. It must be true. The headline didn't even read it. Just that isn't that scary?
It is very scary. I don't know how to answer, honestly.
Yeah,
I feel like I've lost a little bit of the moorings on what people consider to be truth or facts, and I is there like inherent truth in something?
I know. There is truth. Truth has its own side, right? There's sides to the story, but truth, I would argue, has a side of its own. But how do you get to the real
How do you
truth
get
when
to the
yeah,
truth? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
I think everybody has a bit of a play. Like,
yeah.
you know, I probably spend still to this day far too much time on Twitter, and everybody has a
Oh,
motive on Twitter, right? So everyone who's like, this is the inalienable truth, and it's like, well, you've got a newsletter that you're pointing everyone to, right? Or I like you are trying to cozy up to someone who follows this subject on
right,
Twitter, right? So you're going to say the right things, even though, and I hear this all the time, right? Like I hear in our industry a lot, like the public persona of someone is very different than behind the scenes how they view a person that they're trying to cozy up to.
right.
So I don't know, Chris.
Yeah, I'm not. It's a Monday morning, Eric. Sorry, I don't. These are just
I
things
would
in
love
my
to
mind.
say I would
Yeah,
love to say that people have the ability to discern the truth, but I my honest answer is I feel like people have less ability to do that, probably because they're confronted with so much information.
bingo.
They don't have the ability to tell what is 100% accurate, what is 50% accurate, what is 0% accurate, right? Like there's something, to your point, there's something about words in black and white seeming making something more real
Yeah,
than it probably deserves to be seen as. So
yeah,
yeah, I mean, just in terms of like how I approach this, right? I have to be when I publish something, on, or when something of mine is published, I have to be able to the next day if someone says this was wrong, I have to be able to answer that. So all I can control is the 800 or so words that I wrote in a story and say, well, here's why I wrote that paragraph, and here's why this person said this is why I understand why this person said this, right?
right.
So, and really, like, I feel sort of silly at this point talking about like journalism writ large because I'm not doing the world's most important journalism. Like, I think it's important
Yeah, don't
in
sell
the
yourself
context of
short.
helping people in our industry do their jobs better.
Yeah,
But I'm not like uncovering scandals, or I'm not reporting on war zones, and I'm not reporting on, like the
I get
most
it.
important things for journalists to be doing. But if my job is someone has a confusing task ahead of them, can I help make it a little more clear? That's what I try to focus on.
I
So,
think that's the way to get. You nailed it. You nailed it. Well, I would argue though, Eric, and especially, I mean, the headlines, and again, we kind of transition over into kind of what you and I tend to focus on relative to our own professional lives, subject matter wise. This whole tariffs thing, this is big, right? And again, you're saying, well, I'm not solving the world's most pressing issues. I would, true, maybe we're not, you're not out on the front lines over in a war torn country right now. But again, as a father, husband, and all that, right? That's good. I'm glad you are where you are.
yeah.
That
So,
said,
wow.
this
So,
is this all the news that's going on right now. I mean, I would argue that the biggest headlines in any publication right now at least include a blip on the looming trade
oh,
war.
yeah, for sure.
Like, let's get over with. I'm pretty sure people are going to want to hear from a guy that really this is your niche area.
Sure.
How do we even start to unpack this whole tariffs, right? And again, I'm trying to keep politics out of it because I think that's inevitably what it's going to come down to. That's
Yep.
the world we live in. But from as an objective standpoint, what are your own thoughts on just some of the administrations we're hearing, between Canada, Mexico, China,
25% to Canada.
25 here. I think they've kind of drawn back a little bit, and even the entire premise of this is going to be economically like very viable and then
Yeah,
there's you're going to piss off 50% of people no matter what you say. I think that's a lesson for everyone right now.
very
But
true.
but if you are trying to remain objective, Eric, what are your like? I don't know. Take this in any direction. What is the general population and industry people like me? Which we're reading the headlines. Okay, great. What are we missing, and what do you want the audience to understand about the pros and cons, maybe, or just of this again a trade war, effectively?
Well, okay. So I think there's been a lot written, and
Yeah,
there's a lot of experts who've come out of the woodwork on the
experts. Yeah.
topic of tariffs, right? Yeah, I'm putting quotes. Tariffs are a tool. They are
Mhm.
not bad nor good in totality, right? They're a tool that oftentimes is are appropriately used to um, redress some issue that needs to be balanced out. So, for instance, the U.S. has long had tariffs on goods where called anti-dumping duties,
Right.
right? Where the U.S. considers, and it's been sort of okayed by the uh, global organization that oversees trade regulations, that one country is unfairly uh, exporting a lot of a particular type of good into the US, undermining the local sector's ability to compete on price for whatever reason. So the US can apply a tariff or duty on top of that to kind of even out what they consider to be the subsidy of that product, right? So I think most people consider that to be an appropriate use of tariffs or duties. What and I'm sure everyone is going to be really well informed on this, but by the time this comes out, but essentially what the Trump administration has done is qualify the tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. And by the way, as we're talking about this, I'm reading that Mexico has already struck a deal with the Trump administration
Okay.
to delay the tariffs.
I'll delay the tariffs.
I
Okay.
don't know if they're going to be canceled, but ostensibly they've rolled under a emergency powers provision that the president has. So that is where you're using a tool, the tariff tool, to affect change in another area, which in
Yeah.
this case revolves around immigration control,
Yeah.
flow of fentanyl into the
Yeah.
US via Mexico or via China. So whether that's the appropriate use of tariffs is not for me to decide.
Time will tell. Yeah.
Yeah, time will tell. I mean, just using that as a justification is not for me to like. Again,
Yeah. Nor me. Nor me.
I'm dispassionate about this subject. I
Yeah.
cover it. I help
Yeah.
people try to understand it. But tariffs writ large that are sort of applied across the board and not in a very tactical or specific way tend to have a dampening effect on economies, right? They lead to price inflation, and that eventually leads into dampening the economy's, kind of growth, right? So, I mean, that's been proven over time. I would say, like, in general, like very high level, I am someone who believes that, kind of comparative advantage, and
Mhm.
it's not in every country's interest to make every single product that all its citizens need and every subcomponent of every product, right? We are better suited when countries are complementary. Now, the bigger question is who is playing by the rules and who is not playing by the rules, right? And so those are very valid questions. And, take something like the de minimis issue,
Mhm.
which is also, kind of lost in the whole tariff issue,
Yeah.
is they've also announced that starting on February 4th, de minimis from China is going to be stopped completely. De minimis allows you one exporter to ship to a importer, which could be you or me as a consumer, one shipment per day
Right.
valued at under $800. You don't have to file a formal customs entry. You pay no duty
Right.
on that. I think it's fair to say that a lot of people, even the most pro free trade people, have a problem with that level of de minimis and how much it had been used by companies and how little information we're collecting on those shipments. Right. So that's an area where, like, I think most people can say that needed to be addressed.
Yeah.
Right. On the tariff issue, right? Like, I will say, I don't presume to know the future. I don't presume to know whether these will be in place for a long period of time or whether they will have the desired effect on economically.
The crystal ball disclaimer.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, immigration wise, national security wise, like, I'm not going to predict that at all. That's not my job. So, but I just try to help people understand what's going on with them.
You bet.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
Yeah. I will say this. Overwhelmingly, when we talk to shippers, especially on the import side, the thing that bothers them the most is the uncertainty, the aspect of uncertainty. Like, I don't know which way I am supposed to run my business day to day, week to week under this sort of climate, right? Like, it's one thing to say, okay, starting on this day, these tariffs are going to go into effect and this is what it means. But it's another thing to go, oh, next week, you're not allowed to bring in anything, or it's just it costs 25% extra on the wholesale cost. And then next week it might stop because I might have a chat with another head of state and we might come to an agreement. So, oh, never mind. You didn't need to move everything over to Mexico yet.
And that's got to be, I mean, ultra frustrating. So if I'm in the shipper community, right, and we're talking about, on a global scale here, what are you seeing, Eric, from the conversations you have with industry insiders? Could be, whether it's on the ocean container side, the forwarding space, the drayage carriers, the ports. I know, and again, for everybody, TPM, a month out? Almost literally a month, right?
March 2nd we start.
So I know this has got, I assume anyway, a month from now, 24-hour news cycle. Who knows, right? This could be old news.
80 different versions.
Be anything going on in a month the way we live. But I know this can be a hot topic. You got some heavy hitters from across the industry coming. My guess is there'll be at least one panel, if not a keynote or something.
Multiple,
right? So based on what we know today, Eric, what do you like? Again, I think some people, or the implication is that tariffs, could serve a purpose. That, as we've said, is the consumer, though, maybe, are we misreading this in terms of what this potential outcome could be in terms of at the pump, at the grocery store? I got to feel like it's just this cat and mouse game of, okay, you want to tax me? Well, that's got to get passed on to somebody. Is it the end consumer that ultimately takes that hit? And I don't know, are there provisions being put in? I mean, again, I assume the powers to be up in your neck of the woods there at near DC have hopefully thought this through and had, renowned economists with experience. And, these are all assumptions, of course, right? But
I don't know. I mean, it really depends on the product, right?
Yeah.
There will be some products where there's a high enough margin where the producer will probably absorb the tariff to just keep doing business with the buyer. There's other products where, you tack on 25% on a low margin good or a commodity. There's no way for the producer or importer to absorb all of that, so it will get passed on to the consumer.
In an inflationary climate already, right? Like,
I mean, the other issues, like tariffs strengthen the U.S. dollar, so exports become more expensive and less competitive. In when that product is competing in a global market with, products in Brazil or India or China, right? Like, so that's the sort of secondary effect of that. It's not just the consumer, impact to the consumer. It's also, and this is why most economists hate trade wars, is because they have this sort of spiraling effect of like tit for tat. And then, so yeah, most shippers I've talked to on the international side they've been game planning things out for most of 24, and doing a lot of what if scenarios.
Yeah.
But none of them are ready to make major like changes or CapEx kind of moves, or even change like sourcing locations en masse until there's some certainty that these are going to be changed for a long period of time, right? It doesn't make sense to go, well, I'm going to source from Indonesia now instead of China. Oh, he got what he wanted, so now the China tariffs are off again, right?
Yeah.
So
it's a great point.
It's very hard to operate in that environment. So you really just have to sort of like eat those costs in the short term until you get some certainty that they're actually going to be lasting. I would also say most shippers over the last 5 to 10 years have been working on some sort of diversification strategy anyway, where appropriate. Like, sometimes China is the only place you can source something. Most of the time you can like either go somewhere else or try to build capacity in another market. So that, they've been doing that for 5 to 10 years. So this is not like, maybe there's more urgency around it now, but it's not anything that they haven't been thinking about anyway, because no one wants to have all your eggs in one basket anyway.
I
So
think COVID taught us that, right? So I think that
COVID
was a
definitely was a factor.
catalyst.
It
Yeah.
was even I mean, I was writing China plus one stories in 2008, 2009, right?
Yeah.
Like this is not a new phenomenon.
No.
So
What do you think so again, you're in your conversation with a lot of the, and it's an ecosystem, right? So we say the shipper and the, pays the freight bill, and that's all, and then there's the downstream, there's all, it's an ecosystem.
right,
So
right.
what do you see? Anything, any, and I think prediction is such a bad word because it's kind of like, to your point earlier, like literally refresh the news screen and it could be anything. So I get the frustration from the shippers. Like, how are they hedging their bets though? Are we doing some pull forward freight? Do you find that the inventory levels currently,
There definitely
either
was some.
in,
There
yeah,
was, yeah. I mean, all the data and anecdotal discussions were that there was some inventory pulled forward where it made sense
yeah,
before January 20th, because we didn't know how quickly the Trump administration was going to, move on these tariffs. Right?
executive orders. Yeah, they keep
Yeah,
coming.
I mean, I assume some people assumed they would happen day one or day two, right?
Right.
As it happens, it was 10 days in, but at this point, like if it's announced February 1st and goes into effect February 4th, there's not a whole lot of pull forward you can do, right? Like you needed to account for this beforehand.
A
So
long time ago. Yeah.
yeah. So I think I don't. Again, I'm not really sure there's a whole lot that can be done, and
Yeah.
I will
And wait
say,
and see, maybe. I guess
yeah,
that's
I will say there is definitely a posture in the administration and the sort of circles around the administration, whether it's in the government or the people sort of whispering in the ears of those now in the government, that there's not a lot of, sympathy for importers that have built their businesses primarily, if not wholly, on a China to US pipeline, right?
yeah.
Like the
Great point.
feeling I think amongst the administration is um, you have sort of gotten away with things for a long period of time to the detriment of the US population. And now we're not going to have a lot of sympathy for you if your business is exposed to these tariffs that we're putting in. I mean, to put it bluntly, I feel like that seems to be the pretty outward posture of the administration.
I think posturing is a great word for a lot of this because, like you said, it's we're still in a kind of a wait and see, a little bit of a stalemate of sorts, I guess, depending on and it's a flexing. I think at the end of the day, it's just flex, 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 and I guess if you're in the U.S. as we are, like you look at that's a pretty powerful flex, but
Yep.
is it the same flex that we've traditionally had for yesteryear versus with the way the geopolitical landscape has shifted, global trade, Mexico's booming right now, and who's to say if that China's not buddy buddy to Mexico, and you
Yeah.
can circumvent things. I would love to be a fly on the wall in some of these
Oh yeah.
that level, but
I
yeah,
will say that the one thing about these tariffs that have been announced so far is there's no carve outs, right?
right,
They're across the board. So to a certain degree, everyone who's importing from China is in the same
yeah,
boat. No pun intended, right? And so there's no yet advantage to be gained if you are sourcing from China and your competitors are also sourcing from China.
right.
It's Are there carve outs for certain companies or certain products? That remains to be seen. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think there's also some. I will say maybe this is a bit of editorializing. I posted something on Twitter on this earlier today, but I think it's fair to say. I mean, I talk to people in a lot of different countries. Like
Yeah,
that's a
what you
great
do,
perk of my job. It's a cool
yeah,
thing to be able to do. I think it's we are increasingly being seen as a bit of a wild card to deal with now, right? And for the foreseeable future, we will be seen as that. And the question is, do people sort of say, well, this is just a short-term phenomenon and we get back to business as usual, or do they say, well, the country elected Trump, they seem to kind of move back toward a more stable government, and then they reelected him, and now it's more unstable to do business with them. And
right.
now this is sort of like a more permanent kind of view of how the US does things. If I'm putting myself in the shoes of like and someone who's doing business with the US, I'm going to have a different perspective on them than I did before November 6th, right?
Right. Right.
So the question is like how lingering is kind of the damage of how others view us as a trading partner. And there's certainly people in the US who don't give a damn about what other people think about us, right?
Clearly. Yeah.
Sure. Like a lot of people.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the right position to take in a super highly integrated world, but
Yeah.
a lot of people think that, and again, it's like right or wrong. It's not, those are subjective things
Right. That's
to
like
say.
your opinion, man, you
Yeah,
know.
that's just your opinion. Exactly. We need Lebowski right now. So
Well, hey, look, man, I want to kind of that's very helpful, Eric. And like I said, I trust your judgment because again, you're very, with globalization and your world travels and being able to get it. The key word there is hearing perspective, right? And I think I think at JOC in Chicago last year, there was some folks from maybe it was JOC or another event I was at. I go to a few, but there's some Germans and some folks from various parts of Asia, I think Singapore, and it
yeah,
was just interesting to talk because you hear them with all that's going on in the US where, they kind of have their own questions for a US citizen who's in supply chain logistics. And it was interesting to hear their take, right. As
yeah,
from external perspective. So I think you nailed it, right. I do think we need to be cognizant of just the way, call it an optic, but it's there is merit to like the way the world looks at views us as a trade partner. Right. And,
right.
I mean, this is going to be a conversation that the pundits on every major network are going to be
Oh yeah,
discussing at length. To what extent we really know, it goes back. I don't. There's a privileged few, maybe in an Oval Office of sorts, that probably have a little more insight into that. We are not privy to that, of course.
no,
Eric, one of the things that is also really hot, again, you do a lot of technology, right? So, kind of want to not shift gears completely, but we go into it kind of does tie into tariffs and some of the other global discussions being had around this AI and chip manufacturers, semiconductors. The AI just in general is obviously an ongoing topic.
sure.
Anything relative to that from your lens that you feel again for again, there's no right or wrong answers, but talk about a trade war. Is really there's a lot of this the war for the greatest technology, and there's
On AI,
a
yeah.
lot of debate, right? Whoever has the best tech will ultimately
Well,
win. Call that what
yeah.
you
So I
will.
mean, I think you're alluding to kind of like the little bit of war between OpenAI and DeepSeek that
I think,
sort
but
of emerged, right? Yeah,
really between what is are you talking about DeepSeek if it's not out of China?
yeah.
And is that not? I don't know that we are right.
Yeah,
Maybe
if it was a French competitor,
would
we would
be
obviously
right.
be viewing it very differently than if it's
Yeah.
where it emerged from. So, I mean, I think there's some interesting or not parallels, but entanglements with what we're seeing, for instance, in the freight brokerage world, right?
Yeah.
Where out of nowhere, seemingly, in the last year, there's been like a dozen companies who have raised money and are building agents, right? AI
Mhm.
agents for freight brokers or to sort of turbocharge software companies that don't want to invest a ton into like their own proprietary AI, but would rather use it to soup up the product that they actually
Mhm.
build and are selling, right? So um, I think this all is sort of under the umbrella of how commoditized AI is becoming versus whether it's something that like a company can literally become $1 trillion company because they can charge everyone for it, a
Yeah.
lot for it, right? So, um, I obviously it's interesting, right? You would mention the chips, right? There's a physical constraint. The only physical constraint on AI is do you have enough processing power to build, to run the models so the AI
Do we
gets to.
really need as much as this DeepSeek did, at least on the surface, and we'll have to dig into this, but on the surface, they've done it for a fraction of the cost when you talk about the expense around it.
Theoretically,
Yeah,
theoretically.
theoretically,
I mean,
right?
as far as goes back to the self-reporting thing. Like,
Yeah,
as
and
far
that's
as the
just it.
company reporting what it spent, right? Like, can you trust that, right? So, I
And
mean,
that
can
goes
you trust
back
what OpenAI has spent, right?
full circle.
Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, it's like you need chips, you need a lot of cooling
Mhm.
capability, right? Also, because everything these physical facilities get really hot, right? Like you need to cool them down, right? So they need like physical things that go into the physical generators of zeros and ones that
Yes.
are behind everything, right? So I think if we take like a micro, I'm trying to bring this back to like our world as much as we can, because honestly, like I don't really know enough about OpenAI and DeepSeek to have a expert conversation about it. I know what I read, and that's about it. But if you look at it like in the brokerage industry, there are too many companies already targeting the same type of applications of this, right? Do there need to be 30 different companies that offer voice agents to the brokerage community?
Right.
Probably not. Probably not.
Right.
They're not all going to succeed, right? But they're all getting funding, right? Sort of similar to what we saw in previous generations, right? Do we need 10 versions of this? Do we need 15 versions of this? No, but like it tends to be a copycat type of industry. And overall, I think that creates commoditization of those types of tools. So, but I think one thing is clear with all of this, right? Like the writing is a bit on the wall. Like when you hear people talk about, I think Sam Altman at OpenAI just was quoted today or yesterday saying that they believe they will have a single digit. Did you see this? They will have
I
a
did.
single
Yeah.
digit impact on every single like enterprise process by
Yeah.
2030,
It's like
right?
head explodes. Like,
Yeah. So it's like, well, that means that that same percentage of people, if not more, will probably not be required to do that. So what are they going to do? So, and the way I've seen this characterized in, for instance, the brokerage industry, I think it's obviously carriers different, shippers different when you're dealing with the physical components of our industry. It's
you bet.
different.
You
But on
bet.
the brokerage side, where it's literally like desks and computers and
Transactions. Yeah.
physical things that you have, um, you hear more and more the size of a brokerage is going to shrink markedly over the next 5 to 6 years, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know anyone who would faithfully argue the opposite at this point, right? So what does that mean? Where do those people go? What do they do? You don't need 30 different, you're chief strategy officer. You don't need 29 other chief strategy
I
officers.
might. I don't know. Depends on what day you
I
have.
don't know. Yeah, right. You know, there's certain jobs that require a lot of people. There's other types of jobs that having a lot of people is not good, right? And
Right.
so this idea that everyone sort of shifts up market within their company is nonsense.
Yeah.
They're going to have to do something else.
Yeah.
Maybe it's in the industry, maybe it's outside the industry, maybe it's to get paid to sit on a sofa and buy things. Maybe that's going to be a job someday, right?
Could be. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, like, how else do you keep people gainfully employed?
These are again questions that have to be, very again existential type questions. We need to start. I mean, is
I
it
had
just too early for us to know, or just kind of feel? I think at least
way
our
too early. It's
yeah,
way too early to know. I
yeah,
had a chat with someone the other day. It was like when AI is making a bunch of decisions that we make now, is it going to get to the point where like the model has to be trained to keep buying things on Amazon? Like I don't know. Maybe the model will have to buy. Oh, it's been a while since I bought a new pair of shoes. I guess I need to buy a new pair of shoes, just to keep the train running,
yeah.
So
I mean, it just is mind blowing to think of where it goes, because we already see the potential of where it goes, for better or worse, right? It's the
yeah,
utopian versus dystopian future that we just don't know. And I think depending on again what day you ask me, it's like, we're
yeah,
dads, right? So we're thinking about posterity and like,
yeah.
I don't even know. I don't want
What's
to.
that gonna do?
Right. But
Yes,
I assume, like I say, every generation has probably said, this is it.
for
World's
sure.
going to hell in a handbasket. It's over.
Imagine being like in the Industrial Revolution in the late 80s.
Right.
It's
Right.
like, what do you mean we're not going to be like cleaning chimneys? What are we supposed to do now? So,
Yeah, I'm with you. I try to stay, again, I think part of it's just being a father like you, and just somewhat, use some level of try to have optimism in a world that's
sure.
often not
Yeah.
the case.
Yeah.
But go kind of keep it on that same train of thought, Eric. Where else do you, based on your coverage again in logistics, tech, and stuff, what technologies you mentioned, that the broker agents, the AI agents?
Yeah.
What other applications or other use cases do you see, and as a consensus in your conversations with the shipper community? And it's going to vary, shipper, carrier, asset, brokerage, forwarding. Are there any trends that you see? And we can keep it in the AI and automation realm if you wish, but
Yeah.
technology in general, maybe. What are some of the, as we look into, going into the rest of this calendar year, any trends you're seeing on just general technologies as a whole, that, or a sentiment maybe around technology as a
Everything
whole?
is so AI focused
Yeah.
right now. It's really hard to see through the fog of that right now. I
Yeah.
mean, I will say that it's when I look back at my career, especially the last 15 years where I've focused primarily on tech, it's pretty amazing to see how much like core processes haven't really changed all that much, right? Like
Right.
you still have to procure space, tender loads, watch them as they go through their life cycle, then pay
Yeah.
for them, right? I mean, like that doesn't change. We haven't fundamentally changed the paradigm on any of that, right?
Right.
Most software has worked to like refine the rough edges
Yeah.
or kind of make the handoffs a little bit less hairy. A lot of work on kind of like
Yeah.
structuring data around it so you have better insights. But really, like the core process, like the jobs that you did 15 years ago have not changed all that much. They've
Sure.
maybe gotten a little more complex in some ways and easier in other ways. But so that's my like default, like, angry guy on his porch kind of sentiment. Um, my default is always the things that have lasting value from a software perspective are if you touch execution
Yeah.
and if you touch money, right? Right. So those are, I mean, if someone said you have to leave what you're doing right now and you have to start a company in the trucking space or in the logistics space, I would say, well, you got the wrong guy. First of all, if you're going to make me do this, I'm going to focus on an area that is either integrally involved in execution or something to do with money changing hands, because those are the two things that you cannot get around, no matter how
Bingo.
efficient you make everything else.
Right.
Everything else is sort of like if you this is a terrible analogy, but this is the one that just popped in my head. If you're if you go to a fantastic dinner at someone's house and the food is just amazing, but like the house is a mess, they're serving you in plastic cups, but the food is like lights out, you're going to be talking about this meal for years to come. That's the execution, right?
Yeah.
The napkins in beautiful napkin holders and candles that look beautiful and the right mood music, that's all the extraneous stuff that a lot of software vendors are selling to make the experience
Yeah.
feel better. Or,
Right.
but ultimately, like if the food stinks, it doesn't matter how good that all that other stuff is.
Ultimately.
So
Yeah. Food being product, maybe, or execution
food
within
being
product.
execution, yeah, that's what I would say is because you see a lot of companies that are providing data or kind of optimizing something on the periphery,
Mm-hmm.
saying how do I connect this to execution and not just work with a TMS as a channel partner, but actually do something in the TMS that they can't live without after doing it. Because if it's just spinning out there out on the periphery, it's very easy to just like say, well, that's an extraneous cost that we don't really need at all times.
Yeah. I think that, and I saw it firsthand and from my perspective during COVID. I mean, there was just so much of a frenzy and the amount of capital being poured into our industry. Everyone was making a cash hand over fist, no matter where you played in the
Sure.
ecosystem. I mean, it was
Yeah.
good times, right? Historically good times.
Right.
And now we've seen obviously the bottom drop out. There's speculation we're out of this freight recession. I think I saw a polling at a live event, and I think someone had asked, who thinks the freight recession over? I think it was probably about 40 said we think we're seeing the light, but
Yeah.
60 were like, based on our day to day, like boots on the ground,
Not great.
premature for us to really say that.
And honestly, like even if we are, let's just take the presumption that the market is going up and significantly next year.
Yeah,
It's
we're
not going
hopeful.
up. It's
Yeah,
not going up in the way that it did during the pandemic. So you
no,
don't have a lot of like what I'll call disposable income at shippers
exactly.
or 3PLs. You have kind of what you had pre-pandemic, which is where there was a lot of measured decisions,
Mm-hmm.
long sales cycles,
Yeah,
took a lot to get something across the line. And so that's the positive market we're heading into, is just back to that sort of pre-pandemic where it still it was a huge lift to get
Yeah.
anyone to adopt something. So I think that whether the market is recovered or not, that's a different question than whether software will once again be like as frothy as it was
Right.
in 2021, 22.
Well, I think you're seeing, again, every CFO I know since we've kind of gone into a deflationary period, has scrutinized every vendor and put them in the buckets, right? Is this
Sure.
mission critical, core to our business, can't live without it? And I think a lot actually, Eric, fall in the other category of like the nice to
Not
have.
necessary.
We may have gotten in over our skis
Napkin
during,
rings. They were the napkin
yeah,
rings.
the napkin rings, right,
Yeah.
right. And I think that's a harsh reality for a lot of software vendors. But again, it's also indicative of just the market climate. I think the appetite, and you mentioned budgetary restrictions and constraints. Obviously, we're in a razor thin type of business as it is, certain segments especially. But I'm with you, man. I think do you see that and maybe it just coincides with just reality in general setting in, but do you think that in your conversations, Eric, do you think around like AI and automation and all these cool tech, these different solution offerings, is there a level of skepticism now, maybe more than you saw in the past, or is it a mixed bag of some
Yeah,
are like, is
there
it polarizing in the same way that the Silicon Valley's like, we just came out of the Sam Altman briefing, we're going all in, and
yeah.
then you get some people that have been in the game long enough that like, hey, this is just it's a season, it'll pass. I don't any general
Well,
is it a full spectrum?
you know as well as anyone, this is a naturally skeptical industry, right?
Yeah,
Like, show me, don't tell me.
right.
Um, so there's lots of, is this blockchain all over again? I try to tell
Yeah,
people, no, it's not, but that doesn't mean it's like the 180 degrees from blockchain, right? So
right.
I, I think the trouble with the kind of widespread adoption of AI is most people can't conceptualize what like a AI based transformation of their business
Yeah.
looks or feels like. Because first of all, most companies, their data is a mess still. And if you don't have good data, or your 3PLs don't have good data, how the heck are you going to like build
I'll
an
vouch for
AI
that
model,
statement.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's the first step that most companies are still struggling with before they even get to. So the best way to sort of address this is like shrink it down to a single process, or shrink it
Hmm.
down to a single category of spend, and then go, do we have our data in order? And then go to the market and say which companies address that process with an AI backed tool or some
Yeah.
sort of agent, and then do it in bits and pieces. But all of that work may result in something that is not immediately like a huge cost savings.
Right.
Over time it will be,
It's an
but
investment. Yeah.
right. But so then, do you have the appetite to do all that, or are
Yeah.
you just going to kind of sit back and be like, well, at some point this wave is going to overtake me, rather than me try to ride the wave? I'm sorry, I'm terrible analogies today, but
I get
uh
them. Yeah.
yeah, I think a lot of people are just kind of like, there's a huge wave coming. I don't know, I've never surfed before, I don't know, I guess I'm just going to let it go over me, and then I'll figure it out
Yeah, it
once
could be a ripple, or
I
is
can.
it truly a tsunami?
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that's
yeah.
where you get differing thoughts, at least in my conversations again. And there's a generational gap in how people answer, right? I think you see
Sure.
the old school, and I'm not a spring chicken by any means. So I see definitely a high, yeah, a little more skepticism too. Maybe that's just the generational gap, but I also look at it I try to see the Gen Z, right? And
Yeah,
what are they looking for? And I think again, when you talk about our industry, as there's a lot of antiquation in general, I think.
yep.
And I just wonder for some of these companies that have been more incumbent and ruled the roost, I see their point, right? Some of it's like, you're right, the process in many ways, no matter, go back 20, it hasn't materially changed in a lot of ways. Now that the tools available, I think that's where we're getting at. But
Definitely.
I
Yeah.
go back into a lot of promises made by tech and software vendors through autonomous block, you name it, right? What's the hot flavor of the
Right.
month or the year? It hasn't always come to fruition. So I think I'm always trying to balance it here. That's what I'm getting at. I'm trying to say, hey, this
Yeah.
next generation is going to be taking over your business. That's the future leadership. They are very pro tech, augmentation, automation. It's all they know.
Right.
But the
I mean,
leadership in those roles
I'll
is
put
like,
it this way. I'll put it this way. This is how this is the challenge that the industry has is every company, even the most progressive company out there, open-minded, trying every single thing, has systems that were probably bought or built 20, 30, 40 years ago, right?
100%.
So it's that whole changing the airplane wings while you're flying kind
In
of, right?
flight.
Like
Yeah.
hard, if not impossible to do. And it's moving so fast that I have had multiple conversations with companies in the AI space saying, oh, this company that was founded in 2017, 2018, there's no way they're going to be able to catch up to what we're doing because we started in 21, 22, or 23 even. They're like,
Isn't that
you have
crazy?
no idea how fast we can build something because we don't have any technical debt whatsoever.
Right.
Like we don't even have 3-year-old technical debt. We have no technical debt. And so that's how fast it's like the companies that were like everyone was like hating on LinkedIn 5-6 years ago to this day, those are now dinosaurs to the companies that are being founded in 23 and 24.
Isn't it
That's what's
crazy?
crazy about it, right? So,
but you go back, I'm going to use my analogy, right? You go to, it's like consumer electronics, right? You got your flat screen TV when those came out. Oh, this is the greatest thing. You go to CES and it's like the next wave of what's coming. But I think there's probably, and that's at a consumer level, right?
yeah.
But even in a B2B environment, that TV is still fundamentally like, is it really that much better? Did I get caught? And that's and that may not be the best analogy either, but it's kind of like, it's got a few more bells and whistles, the gold ring napkin holder. But do I need it? And I think that's kind of going back fundamentally what a lot of our industry is thinking around tech is how much have we been able to quantifiably demonstrate that this stuff is really making that difference that's been promised?
That's
And
a
I don't
great
know.
point.
Yeah.
That's a great point. So let me give you like another like absurd story that just happened to me over the weekend.
Okay.
So I live not far away from my wife's cousin. So
Okay.
she has 2 boys who are about my son's age. So the middle school, early high school. They had 3 extra monitors that they used for their gaming things, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
they asked us if we wanted one or all of them. And I picked it up and I was like, "Oh, this is really nice." And the one who's in middle school was like, "Yeah, sorry, these are like 22, 23 monitors." I was
Yeah.
like, I don't, that seems relatively new to me. Like a
Yeah.
monitor's changing that fast that I need the
Right.
25 monitor,
What?
right?
Yeah.
Like, but
Kids,
in
what I
his
miss.
mind,
Yeah.
23 monitor is like hopelessly obsolete.
Right.
And I'm like, I'm connecting this to a laptop that was probably made in 2016. So I think I'm good, you know?
Yeah. It
But
worked.
but from a mindset perspective, that's the thing is like, and it's really hard to apply that thinking to an industry that is, still using stuff built in the 80s and 90s and, functioning, maybe not at
Yeah.
optimal capacity, but like functioning.
Yeah. It's a balancing act, man. I'm bullish on tech.
Oh yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm also I'm like an idealistic realist, if that's an oxymoron of sorts. But
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
still like it captures what I'm trying to say is like I
Optimistic pragmatist.
I'm pragmatic,
Yeah.
I often have to walk the line in my last few companies, including mine, of the academic theoretical laboratory environment where extremely smart people, way brighter than me, have cracked the code in a theoretical environment. But again, it goes back to the practitioner and the domain experts that have lived and breathed this industry.
Yeah.
That'll often come, and say, "Well, have you thought about X, Y, and Z?" And again, it's again theoretically you're right, but
Yeah.
but practically and to implement this at mass adoption and scale, like, it's going to be a much bigger undertaking than you ever thought.
Humans have irrational thoughts and behaviors, right? Like I
Yeah.
don't know how much you can model for someone turning their back on a good idea, right? Which is,
Well, it's
so
interesting. I don't, you mentioned you have sons, boy dad as well. And I just wonder, I'm always thinking, we kind of talked about it earlier, like what's the future and what's the job description look like for them when they're, getting in their prime of their professional careers. I don't know, Eric. I really don't. I don't even know what to,
I'm
someone asked me the other day, what do you want?
that's what I'm saying. Like do everything.
Do everything. Yeah.
Be a pianist, like maybe
Yeah.
it's going to be to
What,
be entertained.
what
So,
can't AI do? I think that's the question a lot of people are asking. And I think you could apply that in what I do and what you do. And with the GPTs now and generative. And again, I think there's a lot of just like, it's again, maybe you're just done wait and see. And I asked my son's like, 7-year-old says, hey, what do I want to be when I used, NBA, of course, soccer player, but let's come back down to earth. And then I'm like, well, if I had to push, I'm like, I think that if AI becomes as prevalent as some would have you believe, and you mentioned earlier, what's the future? What do we do all day, right? Like, I think we're going to be all nuts. And I told him, I was like, we're going to the mental health space. I'm like, go and become a psychiatrist, psychologist, a therapist. I feel like we're going to all need somebody to talk to because we're like, because we got to get out of that digital world we're in for a bit, and then exposed to like what human to human interaction. That sounds just
that's a great point.
Crazy.
So basically what we've determined today is the two best jobs are going to be trade compliance and mental health, right? So
which kind of go hand in hand anyway, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, Eric, look, man, I've been talking to you for a while. I could talk to you forever. I wanted to at least let you kind of give. I know we mentioned the events you're having, TPM, coming up in just less than a month. What can people do? Is that a good time? I know you're going to be extremely busy, I assume, leading up into that. I will be at the Inland event, of course, in my backyard again. Can't wait for that. Manifest, I think. I don't know if you're attending. That's coming up.
You'll be there? Okay. Yeah, next week.
Seems to be all the chatter, right? Manifest. So,
yeah.
But let's go back to TPM though. Like, how do people? What can they expect this year for those that may be contemplating on going or not? Who should go, and why should they go this year of any year? Maybe not in the past. This year, maybe it matters more than ever, perhaps.
Yeah, so it's been interesting. So TPM, for those who don't know, is it used to be called the acronym is Trans-Pacific Maritime.
Yes,
but we sort of did away with that because everyone knew it as TPM, and it's become much more than just an event covering Trans-Pacific trade. So it used to be container shipping event where all the BCOs, importers, would meet with their freight forwarders and ocean carrier service providers to hammer out contract negotiations for space on the Trans-Pacific.
Yeah.
This year is the 25th anniversary. So the first one was in 2001.
All right.
Yeah, I know. Amazing.
Good run. Yeah.
I can only take a limited amount of credit for that. But so what it's grown into is a global event. So we cover all the trades now. We also, since the pandemic, it's become a geopolitical kind of discussion more than ever, right?
Like, all the speaker list, man. You got the full gamut. Yeah.
I know. We have all sorts of people who would have never even thought of coming to TPM to speak now. So obviously a lot of stuff on tariffs and trade policy, a lot of stuff on kind of the changing dynamics between ocean carriers and the market, a lot of stuff of blurring of lines between different types of service providers. Of course, we've integrated TPM Tech, which was a standalone event. Now that's inside of TPM. So that's we talk about all the software that sort of governs international logistics.
I have the tech track. Yeah.
I got to have the tech track. So who comes? I mean, honestly, it's importers. There are export focused panels too. Basically anyone in international trade, global logistics, it's pretty applicable to them. Yeah. So, kind of director of international logistics or transportation. We're seeing more people bring kind of like the procurement team or trade compliance teams, or even domestic transportation teams to talk about like transload versus intermodal, drayage issues, right? Like once it's left the port, then it obviously becomes more of a domestic concern. So, but that's actually that's the crux of what we do at Inland, which you referenced, which is Inland Distribution Conference, which is September 29th through October 1st in Chicago.
That's right.
Which I love that event actually, because it's way less chaotic than TPM and just as informative in my view. But TPM, you have to experience it. Like I used to call it the Woodstock of shipping, but it's way more than that now. It's kind of crazy, but you have to experience it if you're in our business.
Well, I encourage everybody listening in that check it out. If anything, again, Eric and his team have put this on again for, you said 25 years.
25 years,
that's commendable in a landscape of events and trade shows and conferences that just
it's
another one pops up every week.
Everyone wants to do events. I can tell you, being on the back end, it's really hard to do events. It's a lot of hand-to-hand, door-to-door stuff to get it, get them off the ground and do them right. So
Well, Eric, before I let you go, man, I know again I give the plug if people want to reach you. I know you're on social a bit. I know you're you're a journalist, so I'm sure there's people that may reach out to you for a lot of reasons.
Yep.
But what's the best? What's the optimal way to reach you?
So stories are at joc.com. That's
Yep.
obviously a good way to find out what we're writing. My team, not just me.
Yeah.
Eric.johnson at spglobal.com. Email. Not always the best way to reach me, honestly. LinkedIn is a great way to reach me. Message me on LinkedIn.
I'll help for that.
Yeah, I do most of my posting on LinkedIn. I am still on Twitter, X, whatever, but mostly just
Elon, whatever.
Mostly just to keep track of, certain members of our industry.
There are those that love to tweet. Yeah.
So, and then those are the best ways to get in touch with me.
Awesome. Well, and before I let you go, what are you most excited about, Eric? I'll leave you with this for 2025. What are you most excited about?
I don't know. It's pretty daunting. It's been a rough January, heavy stuff. So hopefully I'm just looking forward for things to settle a little bit. Yeah. I mean, it's not bad for business when things are chaotic.
I was going to say a lot of headlines.
People want information. They want certainty when things are chaotic. So hopefully we provide a resource for that. But honestly, I'm not sure all of us can take so much chaos all the time, every day. So let's hope it settles into some sort of pattern or rhythm. I think everyone could use a little bit of.
We're only in Q1, right? So we're only in month 2.
Not even halfway through Q1.
And it feels like we've already. I mean, January. Again, it felt like a year, right?
It's been a year.
Yeah. Been a year. Yeah.
It feels like January is always pretty heavy lately. So I'm hoping that things kind of settle a little bit.
I'm with you, man. I think everybody's in that corner of just kind of a wait and see. And I think that kind of ties into everything we discussed today. Is no shortage of topics to kind of that the inquiring minds really want to know more. You nailed it, right? It's just that it's that uncertainty. But again, after living through a pandemic, I hope we're a little more comfortable with just living through uncertainty, because I don't know that we go back to any level of true certainty, right?
We don't have a choice anymore.
We don't have a choice. So, well, look, man, again, Eric, thank you for the time today, man. I guess I'll see you next week, right?
Yeah, I'll see you. I know
there's only about 6,000 attendees, so it's almost like, did I see Eric over the course of 2 or 3 days? And at 6,000 people in the little city of Las Vegas, obviously a lot of overstimulation in general. So I'll make a point. I always find you. Could be if you can see, we'll find each other. You know the blackjack table. We always, our spot. So, well, again, thanks, Eric. Been a pleasure, man. Hope to kind of, I want to keep in touch. I'd love to have you back on sometime, because I think you're right.
Thanks so much for having me on. This has been super fun. Honestly.
You bet. Yep. Well, I'll see you next week, and I'll see those for you tuning in very soon. I think we have another episode maybe this week with another special guest. So again, this is Chris for another episode of Semi-Related. We'll see you soon. Thanks again, Eric Johnson.
Bye.